Fear. It's a very unpleasant feeling that we just can't seem to get enough of. I mean, not all of us though. Some people are way more susceptible to horror than others. Some people can go through an entire haunted house without feeling a damn thing. Others get scared just looking at the cover of a horror movie. I am terrified right now. But terror for entertainment has been a common pastime for a long time now. The first instances of supernatural horror happening on film were in the 1890s by French filmmaker Georges Méliès. He showed living skeletons in his silent films. This would be the origins of horror movies. Well, horror movies are among one of the most popular categories of movies in the modern day, and there's a bunch of them made every year. But should a genre with 7 wrong turn movies really be taken seriously? You would think after 7 movies they would have learned to take a left turn by now. Well, horror movies are indeed a very fun time for anyone who wants to be scared, or just being scared with friends, because even the worst ones have some entertaining concept going on, even if it is a cinematic mess. But I'm supposed to be talking about horror games, aren't I? Well, I think it's important to talk about horror movies, so we can truly discuss the merit of horror games since horror movies came out first. The logic of a horror game is basically to put the player in a horror movie. Now naturally, having the player in control of a quote-unquote horror movie does sound like a great concept. Yeah, it is why we have so many Resident Evils, so many of them. But I think calling them an interactive horror movie is oversimplifying it, and a bit demeaning because it ignores the work that goes into making one. But honestly, are most horror games good? Well, that's an interesting question because horror games do receive a lot of criticism because a good majority of them are not scary for the average consumer. And the older the horror game, the more outdated it might seem, which might take away from the fear factor. But obviously you can't take the entire genre and call everything in it mediocre. I mean, horror games have been some of the most popular games on the internet, but even then you can't help but look back at some of them and think, wow, they sure look outdated. So I'm going to be taking a look at some horror games made in the last few decades and discuss whether or not they aged well, or are they even still scary. Now it's a bit hard to judge where I'm going to start with this since what could be considered a horror game was a bit weird back when gaming was just beginning. Killer Shark was an arcade game made by Sega in 1972 that could be considered the first horror game. But I don't know, this cover is more funny than anything. My eyes are on the shark. And also it's an arcade game. Most arcade games back then were just meant to be fun, so I'm not going to consider this a horror game. So with all that out of the way, let's take a look at some of the most important horror games made in the last few years.
You're probably wondering what I'm doing in the middle of a cemetery at midnight, the late hours of the night. Well, you don't gotta worry, I was just doing an experiment to bring a zombie back to life. It did not work, so we're moving on to plan B for a fun Halloween surprise. We're carving out a pumpkin. And you're probably wondering where the pumpkin is. Well, I couldn't get one, mostly because Walmart would not let me walk in with a big ass knife. I should have gone to Target instead. But anyway, I managed to find a suitable replacement. Horror games. Yep, this baby will make an excellent replacement for a pumpkin. I mean, they're not that different from each other. They both seem all scary and colorful and spooky on the outside. But once you look deep into one, they're kinda hollow and empty on the inside. That's not to say all horror games are bad though. But you don't see people putting Outlast on their porch, which is why I will be starting that trend. Now we wait. No one came to my house to trick or treat. Apparently Outlast is not a suitable replacement for a jack-o'-lantern. Well, I still have you. Time to carve you. This is gonna be tricky.
Well, horror games didn't always start out well with horror. Some of the earliest examples of horror games like Haunted House for the Atari 2600 didn't have the graphical power to be able to properly show anything scary. It was mostly just blue and black pixels with other sprites that represented ghosts and bats. The way it did show that it was indeed a horror game was by using the cover in the instruction manual, which was how any horror game in these times compensated for the lack of convincing graphics for, well, horror. Oh, and finding an instruction manual in a game box is pretty scary these days, so developers obviously wanted to be creative with how they transmit horror to the player. And I mean, I guess it's better than nothing. It's not like anyone's gonna get spooked if they see the cover of Revenge of the Beefsteak Tomatoes. That tomato do be wanting revenge though. But still, this wasn't convincing enough to warrant actually taking the place of a horror movie, or well, getting the same sensation as one. That wouldn't change until a few years later with games such as Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now what was going through the developers' minds when they were making these games was, what if we take this and put it over here? I mean, it makes sense. The easiest way of convincing people that you made a horror game is by taking well-known horror franchises like Friday the 13th and Halloween and making games from them. Anyone who saw these games would obviously realize these games were meant to be scary, but it was an important step in making more atmospheric horror games. They can now add cutscenes into the game that could serve as a horror element in the game, since now the game had better graphical capabilities and could do a better job at trying to emulate the horror experience. The music was also improving so they could make a more convincing atmosphere. Since Friday the 13th was on the NES, it obviously had more power to work with, but still, even taking account of all the limits of the time, Friday the 13th was still objectively a bad game. It just wasn't made properly and had many flaws, as were most of the movie-inspired horror games, but they did do a good job of moving the genre forward, and especially when they could only work in 2D environment. But it was at this time that game developers would look at these games through a new angle: 3D. 3D games were the talk of the town in the early 90s, with more games taking advantage of 3D technology. And with 3D, it would be easier to create more immersive experiences for the player. So we would see the start of more 3D horror games, with the most notable one being Alone in the Dark. This is what most considered to be the first real attempt at a 3D horror game, and it would end up being one of the most influential horror games ever made. It even got 2 movies based off of it, although they weren't exactly masterpieces. Hey, chase a bag, right? Never mind. Although everything that happens with this franchise after the first game isn't exactly noteworthy, it does have an important place in horror game history. This was the first horror game to use 3D models and made convincing 2D backgrounds that would add even more to the feeling of actual terror. This, along with better use of sound effects and a fixed camera, would make it an actual scary experience. And that was something that no other game had managed to do previous to Alone in the Dark. And it was a massive success, selling over 600,000 units in its first 5 years, which was unprecedented for horror games at the time. While the game might look dated now thanks to the graphics not holding up as well, and it uses horror elements that have been used hundreds of times by horror games made after it, but for when it was made, it was still a pretty impressive accomplishment. And while it might not be the scariest game ever made, it did push the horror genre in new directions. And due to it being such a new take on the horror genre, it did influence other games by creating a subgenre called survival horror games. And from that subgenre, we would get 2 of the biggest gaming franchises of all time: Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Now, Resident Evil was actually directly influenced by Alone in the Dark, since they both had very similar camera setups, and Resident Evil also used 3D models. But as most of you can figure out, although Alone in the Dark can be considered influential in the creation of Resident Evil would go on to become a massive franchise. They even got 6 movies made from it, making $1 billion across all 6 movies. Although the movies weren't very good, it just shows how much demand there was for Resident Evil, or Biohazard as it's known in Japan. The game focuses around zombies, which again are a very common monster you find in horror, but Resident Evil is the gaming franchise that best made use of them. The first game was an astounding success. It made use of puzzle solving and inventory management along with horror to make an incredibly fun experience. The way the camera was set up also made for a very uneasy environment and made the player feel trapped in the mansion they were playing in. The thing about Resident Evil is that it's still as popular today as it was back when the game first came out, if not more popular. There's 7 main series games, with the 8th one coming out in 2021. The whole survival horror genre has been revolutionized by Resident Evil to this day, even more so thanks to some very successful remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3. While you can debate whether or not the games are enjoyable, you can't deny how much of an impact they've had on the horror genre. And as I mentioned earlier, there was another franchise that also had a lot of success: Silent Hill. Now, unlike Resident Evil, Silent Hill wasn't directly influenced by Alone in the Dark and had a much more different style of horror. While the first one can indeed be considered a survival horror game, as more games in the franchise started being released, it moved from being a standard survival horror game to a psychological horror with survival elements. And that's why it became such a unique piece of horror. It used psychological horror and a bigger emphasis on the world surrounding the main character, which is something that wasn't done as much by horror games when the Silent Hill games were first being released. It used the mental problems that characters were facing to convey fear and made it seem a lot more real. It also added monsters to it, but did so in a way that didn't take away from the narrative being told and didn't make the game seem silly. Although the monsters weren't the focus, Pyramid Head still stood out due to his creepy and very bleak design. And just like Resident Evil, Silent Hill also got movies based off of it, and they were movies Can't deny that. They had Sean Bean. But unlike Resident Evil, Silent Hill has kind of fallen off nowadays, and doesn't get much attention mostly due to the lack of recent games from the series. Although there was PT, which was a Hideo Kojima project that was cancelled, but it got a lot of attention when the demo was released. But rumor is that PT might not be completely dead. Well, now we move on to more modern horror games, and there's quite a few notable ones. Outlast is considered as one of the scariest games made in modern times. It's a survival horror game with some very disturbing imagery and claustrophobic environments. While it might not reinvent the wheel or anything, it does do a good job of making a terrifying experience. It's not extremely unique, but it's probably some of the best that horror games have to offer. Speaking about more unique horror, there's another horror franchise that was very popular, Five Nights at Freddy's. We all know about it. There's animatronics, they try to kill you, and there is a ton of yiff of it. That last part might be a bit unnecessary. It does make use of jump scares as the scary element, which is something that you see a lot these days in horror. But the gameplay was so simple and the lore was so interesting, it just blew up. While it might not be the scariest game, it's one of the biggest horror games in the modern day. And that's the thing, horror games have kind of been needing to stand out more in order to get attention. It kind of has to do with the fact that although graphics are getting better over the years, that's why so many horror games that become popular now are made by relatively small companies. Games like Slender and Doki Doki Literature Club. None of these games had intensive budgets or anything, but they were so unique from most horror games that they stood out and became massive hits. And that's the problem with horror games now, they just all blend in with each other. But I mean, it's to be expected as it gets harder and harder to scare people, because what we find the scary has been done multiple times in the past, so it's just kind of boring now.
But hey, being scared is always a fun time. There's nothing better to do on a Halloween night. So if you excuse me, I will enjoy the rest of my evening. Hey, so if you're wondering who brought you back to life and dug you out of your grave, it was the people over there, right? It was them. I saw them bring a shovel. Yeah, but bye. That's their problem now.